Good morning from the back of Beans. So last week I was a little bit sick and I'm feeling a little bit better today. So I'm super excited to give you the history of Washington, D.C. and the passwords that you can tell me where you want me to go while I'm here. Before we get into that though, I do want to talk to you about something that happened this weekend in Washington, D.C. It has a direct relation to the video that I've been working on for the last week and a half, the history of Iran. If you are one of my students and you can figure out what it is that happened in Washington, D.C. this weekend that has a direct connection to the history of Iran, put it in the comments below and you'll be allowed to pick the area that I do an extra video on after Iran. All right, let's get into the history of Washington, D.C. so I can get you this password and you can tell me where to go. Be sure to stay tuned until the end of this video because I have 5 funny facts for you about Washington, D.C. that I didn't even know, and I lived here for almost 12 years. So, Washington, D.C. was founded in 1790 and was established because Maryland and Virginia basically donated land to be able to kind of create this square-like shape. A little bit later, though, Virginia was like, yeah, we want some of our land back, and they took back a portion, and you can see from the picture how it's not a perfect diamond or perfect square. So Washington, D.C. is broken up into quadrants: northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast, and each quadrant has a tremendous history, but I don't really have time to go into all of that because this is only a 5-minute video. So I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures to make you feel as though you're here. Northwest has about 42% of the population. There's also the National Mall here. The National Mall is a big, huge space that connects the U.S. Capitol building, the Washington Monument, and the Lincoln Memorial. So if you're a tourist, you're going to want to come to this area because you can see all those special buildings, and then also too the Smithsonian museums. That's a group of museums where you can go for free and see a ton of different things: air and space, portraits, massive art, the history of the Native Americans. It's absolutely incredible. Oh, and the Holocaust Museum. Very sad, but a wonderful museum. The Northwest Quadrant also has the U Street Corridor, which is where I used to teach. Around that area is a university called Howard. Howard University and Georgetown University are pretty famous in the Washington, D.C. area. Now, besides that, the U Street Corridor is famous for something called ragtime. Back in the late 1800s, prior to jazz, there was something called ragtime that broke out in St. Louis, and it traveled all the way to Washington, D.C. and then became super big in the U Street Corridor. So there's all these like jazz clubs and super cool music scene here. That's Northwest. Now, Northeast doesn't really have too much there, but there's universities and colleges. Southwest and Southeast have the Anacostia River, which is a pretty famous river that runs up through Maryland. Now, we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk a little bit about our government because that's very important since we're in Washington, D.C. So in order for us to understand Washington, D.C. in the past and where they are today, we really have to understand the government. So the way that the Founding Fathers set up the federal government is that there are 3 separate branches that all have equal say. There's the executive branch, which is like the president, the vice president, the ones who sort of execute the laws, federal agencies, things like that. The judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, the different court systems, the ones that evaluate the laws, and the legislative branch, which is Congress. Congress, they're the ones that make the laws. Congress is broken into 2 parts, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Every state has 2 senators that are sent from their state to represent the Senate portion. The House of Representatives is based on population, so it varies from state to state. Now, here's the thing. Remember back in the beginning of this video when I said that Maryland and Virginia donated land to create a neutral ground? Originally, this area, this space, was supposed to literally just be federal buildings. Nobody was expected to live here. Well, now there's tons of people that live here. It's a huge city. And believe it or not, in the federal government, Washington, D.C. has no Senate representation. They have 1 person in the House of Representatives that shows up. She or he is allowed to have conversations and sort of voice their opinion, but they're not even allowed to vote when it comes time for the bills to pass. So every single person that lives in Washington, D.C. pays taxes. But do they actually have any say on the bills and the laws that are taking place? Now, in your brain, what you should be thinking to yourself is, I remember Shannon talking about the revolution, and the American Revolution started because people were upset that they were being taxed, and they kept getting taxed and taxed and taxed, and nobody listened to them. Can you imagine living in a city and having taxes imposed upon you. It's the state that Washington, D.C. is in right now. So if you look at the back of their license plate, it actually says taxation without representation. That I think is super duper interesting. So the last thing I kind of want to talk to you about that involves Washington, D.C. that I thought was pretty cool involves the War of 1812. So the War of 1812 actually was taking place over in Europe. Britain woke up one day and they were like, hey, we don't have control over as much water as we thought. This is going to be a problem because we can't export, we can't import, we can't explore, we can't make money, and this is going to be a problem. So they started poking around at all the different places that they had either lost or had conflict with before. And France and Britain, they got into a big, huge argument over in Europe. During this time, Britain also thought about the United States, and they were like, they shouldn't be in our water either. So they sent people over to the United States. And everybody was sitting there talking, and they were having conversations. And of course, the British were like, stay off our water. And the Americans were like, no way, Jose. And they were having this big, huge argument. And then all of a sudden, they, meaning the British, decided to light fire to the White House. So the White House goes up in smoke, and simultaneously the Library of Congress goes up in smoke. Now, the Library of Congress is the largest library in the United States of America, and it houses a bunch of different books, including books that were used to write the Articles of Confederation, which is the Constitution before the Constitution, and then the Constitution, all of our important work. All these books go up in flames, and everybody in the United States is like, oh no, what are we gonna do? And Thomas Jefferson, out of the kindness of his heart, donated $23,950 to replace all of the books that got burned during the War of 1812. Now, that doesn't sound like a ton of money because I'm pretty sure my van is worth about that, but $23,950 in 1812 is about $2 million today. So Thomas Jefferson donated $2 million of his own dollars to replenish the Library of Congress after it got burned by the British because they were upset that the Americans were in their water. Now on to the 5 funny facts that I found about Washington, D.C. So the first funny fact that I found is that the British who burned down the White House actually dined there before they burnt the White House. So they had dinner with the Americans before they burnt the White House, and the Americans had no idea it was coming. Crazy. The second funny fact is that George Washington never actually lived in the White House. He stayed in Mount Vernon, which is in Virginia. Washington was picked and named as Washington, D.C. because he wanted a place that was neutral and kind of close to where he lived, which was in Mount Vernon. Number 3 is that football huddles were actually created at Gallaudet University, a university dedicated solely to the support of deaf and hard of hearing students for university education. What had happened was there was a deaf quarterback and he needed to sign the plays, but in order for him to sign the plays, he needed to do it in secret. So everybody huddled around him to be able to block him being able to sign the plays. So I forgot to record the closing of the video, so I'm recording it in the coffee shop that I usually go to right now. So that was the end to the history of Washington, D.C. and the history of Iraq is going to be coming out hopefully in the next couple of days since I'm feeling a little bit better. I hope you guys are doing well, and I hope you got the password. Don't forget to sign in and tell me where you want me to go. I'll talk to you later. Bye.